Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
One more time, I'm a Baptist preacher, so good afternoon, everyone.
You look for some response?
Certainly, it's a pleasure and truly an honor to join you all for this historic conversation, this historic UN side event taking place here at the second session of the United Nations Permanent Forum, People of African Descent. We've come together today really to address concerns about efforts to address past racial traumas and racial harms, that being reparations, coming from across the length of this country, but across the world, as we know. Reparations is not a new movement, it's not a new debate. We know that this is a movement that's happening locally as far as colleges and institutions, churches, also states are taking up the issue of reparations, but globally, we know that this is a matter for people of African descent across the world. And so we come to this conversation centering not the question, but the undeniability of the humanity of people of African descent. And as we open this conversation, it should not be lost on us that this day marks the 102nd anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, in which white supremacists annihilated and murdered Black children, Black women, Black men in egregious crime against humanity. And so we come together not only remembering those who have lost, who have been killed, but those who still remain, those elders who lived through the trauma and who bear witness to the work that must be done. So we've gathered today with an incredible panel of thought leaders and scholars that will offer recommendations and a sense of where we are in the reparations movement globally. To my right, to your left, we have the Reverend Dr. Iva Carruthers, who serves as the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We have Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, one of the co-coordinators of this side event, who represents the World Council of Churches. And to my left, we have Ekemini Uwan, who is a public theologian, author, and a critical activist in the movement for reparations. So we will hear from our leaders to hear the recommendations, to hear their statements, and then we will move into a guided conversation amongst all of us as it relates to the global reparations. Dr. Carruthers. Okay, we'll start with Ekemini Uwan.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to start by first and foremost that our brother Cam Howard, who is president of Reparations United, could not be here, but he is our fellow co-laborer and comrade. And so he actually sent remarks. And so I have the distinct honor of reading those remarks to you. And then after that, I will actually give you my own thoughts and remarks. So I just want you to know that what I'm reading is from Cam, who is here in spirits, okay? So he starts by saying, greetings all who are in attendance at this convention, Faith and Reparatory Justice. Of course, it was my desire to be with you all there in person, but family matters have me in Israel at this time. Many of you may know there is a contingent of former Black Americans who began settling in the city of Dimona, Israel in the 1970s. That group is known as the African Hebrew Israelites or Black Hebrew Israelites. I mention this because at a Faith and Reparatory Justice side event at the second of the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, even in attempting to practice our religion. For decades, the government of Israel vehemently opposed the settlement in Dimona. The U.S. government also engaged in clandestine operations in support of Israelis' violations of the human rights and dignity of these African descendants. Although now citizens of Israel, I believe there are repertory demands to be made to both the Israeli and the U.S. governments. Although that is not the reason for my visit, just putting this on the radar here at this forum. As you all may also be aware, the Global Circle for Reparations and Healing delivered to the Vatican a reparations present that detailed repertory demands of the Roman Catholic Church. The presentment to the Holy See in furtherance of reparations. Number one, detailed the crimes and offenses of the Roman Catholic Church in particular. citing the church declared and sanctioned the destruction of African kingdoms, the plunder of African wealth and resources, total war on African people, and the perpetual enslavement of Africans and their descendants, and contributed to the creation of a racial hierarchy of humanity by endorsing the lie of white superiority and Black superiority. Number two, the continued impact of injury on the African world as a result of those crimes, the church contributed to the creation of a global racial animus that has placed Africans and people of African ancestry at the bottom rung of humanity. Number three, reparatory justice initiatives that are demanded, a statement of full acknowledgement and recognition, an apology consistent with international norms, customary law, and Christian values, a commitment to global reparatory justice and healing organizations, the issuance of directives to offending Western nations to also engage in redress, the rescission of papal bulls on the enslavement of Africans and people of African descent, the issuance of encyclical on reparations and healing for African people, the establishment of a papal commission to develop and fund reparations proposals, a generous global monetary commitment to reparations and healing. We shared knowledge for our actions in Rome at the first meeting of the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent from the Assembly Floor in Geneva, and also at a side event where Dr. Amara Inya, Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, and Reverend Kennedy Moore. From the floor of the Assembly of PFAD 1, I also asked representatives of the Permanent Forum to recognize the reparations presented model as an international legal document that concisely and succinctly lays forth reparatory justice claims on non-governmental entities that were complicit in the crimes against the humanity of Africans and people of African descent. Shortly after the historic gathering, the president of the Permanent Forum, Madam F.C. Campbell Barr, in her official capacity, sent an additional letter to the Pope echoing the statements and conclusions of the GCRH's reparations presentment. Although focusing on an official apology for the Pope, one of the GCRH demands, the president also endorsed the Global Circle's reparatory actions that are necessary to address the damages caused. Additionally, in citing the GCRH's actions in her request for reparatory justice from the church, we believe she did, in fact, lift up and recognize the legitimacy of reparations presentment as an international mechanism for repair. Her letter was entitled Request to Pope Francis for the Catholic Church to Seek Forgiveness, Reparation, and Reconciliation with People of African Descent in America and the Caribbean towards the path of human forgiveness. It is our hope that you there press the Madam President for results for her letter to the Pope. Insist that further engagement moves beyond recognition of the work, but also inclusion of the civil society, and that the PFAD put out an official statement declaring the legitimacy and utility of the reparations present. Again, it is a document that succinctly lays out the crimes and offenses, the continued impact of those crimes and offenses, and the reparatory justice demands of the offending guilty non-governmental party. Go to gcrh.org for a copy in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, or Italian. As a result of the GCRH reparations presentment and President Campbell Barr's request for reparatory justice, there was no coincidence that on March 30th, 2023, the Vatican, through its joint statement of the Dicasteries for Culture and Education and for promoting integral human development on the doctrine of discovery, feebly attempted to run from their actions by seeking pardon from the papal bulls that collectively provided political and legal extraction of land and genocide of Native peoples. Again, one of our demands were rescission of these bulls. But true to form, the church made no mention of the bulls in connection to the Third Total War and enslavement, as President Campbell Barr also noted in her letter. In this regard, the GCRH is planning a second trip to the Vatican. We hope all here to join in planning for outcomes of that trip. Dr. Inya will share with you how to sign up for that engagement. Thank you for this opportunity to share. So I'm going to still talk, but I'm going to pass this for a minute.
Thank you so much, Reverend Crawford, and to Reverend Bennett. Just to say, as my colleagues have said already, this is really a part two of a conversation. At the first Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, we had a conversation very explicitly, and it was very well received, this conversation. And that theme was the churches owe a debt. the church's forward debt. During the deliberations at that time, it was clear that obviously it's not just the churches, but faith communities, wherever they are, wherever there has been a institutionalization of occupation of systemic racism and systemic colonialism. That's where we need to call into question the possibility of reparatory justice. What does it look like when we look at the whole landscape of faith and spirituality? So just to be clear, this is a revisitation of that conversation expanded. And that is why we have this thing, faith and reparatory justice. So please know the conversation is open to spirituality, religion, and faiths, plural, relative to our time today. My task is really to say more about, if you will, the landscape as at least I'm viewing it for this moment. There's a lot more that needs to be said. And I'm very pleased serving at Bread for the World, where I'm Senior Associate for Pan-African Engagement, as well as a newly elected president of World Council of Churches, that at the World Assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany, last year, we have adopted a framework at the World Council of Churches to take us to the next assembly to engage issues just as the one we're speaking of now. We're very serious about that. I'm honored to be the convener for that global conversation. And we now have that document that is moving us forward to the Central Committee meeting that will now begin the implementation of what was adopted in Karlsruhe. That will be taking place today, March 5th, tomorrow, this month, June. We will be meeting on the 20th of June, and we will be acknowledging our 75th anniversary. And at that 75th anniversary, we will have the relaunch of what it means for WCC to look at itself critically and to look at the member churches and have them to help look critically at what they have as their histories and their legacies relative to the issues, not only of racism, but the other intersectional issues that also affect the issue of race and justice. So we are very delighted to be here in this space. The UN has been a historic partner of the World Council of Churches since its very inception. Since the inception of World Council, the inception of the United Nations, we have been walking close together for all these 75 years. And so we have a long-term relationship, and we're very pleased that we're actually in the place of the of the United Nations Church Center that is owned by one of our member churches, the United Methodist Church, and the World Council of Churches is located here on the 10th floor. We thank our host, Rev. Ryan Smith, and others of the staff team who have helped us to have this space. That's another indicator of our partnership. So I want to continue with some of the more substantive points that I would like to make. I thought it was important to kind of ground that background, because this is not just a conversation. This is moving to recommendations that are to fuel and to incite and to inspire the declaration of the permanent form of people of African descent. And I know most of you have been in that space, so you know we're having a really important time at this moment. And so we're right at the midstream. Yes, we strategically said we want to be at the midstream so that we could be heard by tomorrow in the recommendations. So as we move forward, be thinking about recommendations. It's not just a conversation, it's a movement. So where do we go from here? But the landscape piece. So in the United States context, let's start from there since we're in New York and we're in Harlem, right? We've already heard Harlem was like all of that, right? Mm-hmm. And we're there on Monday evening celebrating Harlem and its legacy for people like, again, the multi-faith landscape of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz. Of course, many people don't always say this, but Marcus Garvey was the man of faith. W. Boyce wrote the prayers. I mean, so, you know, when we talk about the beginnings of Pan-Africanism, we know that spirituality and faith had everything to do with what their actions showed us, whatever that particular perspective was. So here we are in this moment, and we know we have been people of resistance, spirituality from day one. And that's part of what I want to say here. We have in this moment not just the vision of reparatory justice, we're in a movement of reparatory justice. And that really needs to be said very clearly. This is not something we're thinking about or been dreaming about. It's happening. It's happening. We have been hearing about the African Union. It's now taking leadership, making global consultations coming up. In the United States space, we think about what's happened even at my alma mater, Princeton Theological Seminary. So, I mean, we actually did a historic audit since 300 years and said, oh my gosh, yes, we did that. Yes, we had people who were enslaved who helped build this school. Yes, there were colonial vestiges that were still here and are still here. And I'm pleased to say that it was also Black students at Princeton Theological Seminary said that the analysis is not enough. Analysis is not enough. There has to be some action. And so the caucus of Black students, and even when I was there, was always an active play of students of African descent, rose up and said, what is our action plan? What is the action plan? And I think that's what we're asking for now. So that's happened. That's happening. And at this point, we have our first person of African descent, who's actually the new president, just to say that's one of the actions that's come out of that. We have Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, one of the oldest seminaries also in the United States, linked to the Episcopal Church, which is also linked to the Church of England, also, of course, in the UK. In both of those cases, Virginia Theological Seminary had done a review similar to what Vincent has done and looked at its legacy and how it too needs to have an implementation of its action plan, which they are engaging as well. But then their kindred over in UK, the Church of England, the primate himself, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has actually worked with people within his fellowship who said it's time for us to own up. We need to own up to our legacy of colonialism, enslavement, and all the rest that's been linked to that. So they are actually implementing reparations right now. It's over 10 million pounds, I believe it is, that is actually been set aside to speak to this. And it's not been without pushback, obviously, because there are those within the framework who want to say, no, we need to pay for pension funds now. There are other things that are urgent. But he has stood firm and said, we have to atone for what we have done. So I'm very sorry Deacon Hewitt cannot be here. He wanted to be here, but he's now been appointed as the person to implement and to call for more of what needs to be done. So this is just the beginning. And this is coming from officials at the Church of England. This is just the beginning. So we have some energy. I mean, I could point to a different amount of time, but at the faith level, these things are happening. The examinations, the scrutiny, the conversation of where we need to be and where we are right now. It's happening. These are illustrations. You've heard what my sister has said about the Catholic Church with the presentment. This is something that is happening. We know there are 60 locations throughout the United States that are already mobilized around the issues of reparatory justice. We've heard about CARICOM and to the AU. So we are in the moment. And I think that's the important thing we need to say. We are in the moment of this movement. This is not an idea. This is an action. But finally, I want to say, not only do we need to look at faith institutions, we need to look where faith institutions have had their influence, where faith institutions have, if you will, guided and informed public institutions and private institutions. And one of the places I want to start at, and I'll be finished here, is 1884 to 1885. I know some of you, a lot of you all probably already know what happened in 1884, 1885 in Berlin, Germany. In Berlin, Germany, we know that there was a conversation about what is Africa supposed to look like. But there weren't any Africans there. Oh, by the way, there weren't any persons of African descent there either. This was a Euro, US, Canadian conversation. And it was to codify what had happened in the 17 and 1800s to say, this is our vision of what Africa looks like. And that's what they did. It was an imperialist agenda that set up what we now know as the so-called nation states of Africa. That was in 1884, 1885. We're coming up on the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference. That particular conference also had the imprimatur of those who were in the faith communities. There is no way to get around that. The history is clear. So 1884, this is one of several examples. We don't have time to talk about everything, but 1880-45 matters. And we're coming up on the 140th anniversary. Faith communities were at that table. And some of them, we were represented by those who were going to the churches at the time to make those decisions. So we can't just talk about faith in terms of the institutions and the so-called official institutions of faith. We have to talk about it of the influence of people of the faith who are ambassadors and emissaries in the public space and the private space. So when we look at this moment, we need to be critical from the lens for, I would say, the lens of faith, because there are different streams of faith, right? What are the moral, legal, spiritual trends that allow us to examine who we are and who we are not? So both in the public, in the private, faith, spirituality, and those trends of universal truths and scrutiny is this moment for us now. And so I would invite you to be thinking about that as you're thinking about what does reparatory justice look like? Legally, morally, spiritually, and otherwise. Thank you so much.
Thank you to my fellow panelists and to my son in the ministry. Because I'm so very, very proud that you sit here with us, representing the next generation who is taking this movement forward. I come to you today as I think the elder on the panel. And there's a lot going on in my mind, body, and spirit right now in terms of what I might share. When you mentioned 1884, I think it's important that we invoke the memory of Callie House, who also started and made the first demand of reparations in 1884 with two faith leaders as her co-founders of that organization. I think that's very important to juxtapose that against the words of Howard Thurman, who said at the bottom of the boat as he sailed back to Africa for the first time, what manner of spirit must my foreparents, what my ancestors had to be able to survive this travail of the transatlantic slave trade. I bookend my reflection as I invoke the spirit of my mentor, one of my mentors, who I belovedly would never come to New York and not visit, and that was the Dr. John Henry Clark from Harlem. Most people don't know Dr. Clark as anything other than a historian, but I know Dr. Clark is also a literary writer. He wrote over 400 short stories. The first story he wrote was The Child Who Painted Christ Black. It was a story that he wrote as an adolescent, for which he was kicked out of school because the white county supervisor said, "How dare you create a situation in which a child would envision the divinity within." He ended up, it's a long story, I was like his daughter, but he ended up going to New York on a train. That was because some prostitutes had said, "John, you don't belong here. We have saved our money and we have bought you a set of encyclopedias. You go forth and make a difference for our people." He went with the knowledge of Schomburg in his mind and his spirit. He got off the train and went to the library. There he found Schomburg and John Jackson, who became his teacher. And it is that understanding of the divinity within, which I think is the through line between Howard Thurman and Mother Callie House, that I want us to focus on. Because as I reflect on the work I did at the UN for Durban, and the piece I wrote on the church and reparations, I had to honestly, as I left my closet in conversation with God, ask the question, what happens when the new master looks like us? And so I want us in this moment to think about that in terms of the demand for reparations, because we can have a lot of change, but not transformation. And there's not enough money that they can pay us for. There are not enough demands for transactional dollars and currency that they can pay us for the travail of our people, the suffering of our people, the ma'afa. And we as faith leaders are uniquely positioned to make sure we carry that voice. And so the demand must be made, but also the accountability and the integrity must be held. And if not, it will not matter. And that's what I see for this moment. And so when I think about where we are now from Geneva, and I was just with Reverend Hewitt in Geneva a couple of weeks ago. He understands full well that that 100 million is only on paper. There's a whole lot of work to be done to make that real. It's the fake check that Dr. King talked about, right? And so I think that we need to cast this vision. If we just left the session around Pan-Africanism, and we heard the extent to which we can clarify what does justice look like. And what does justice look like takes us back to Pan-Africanism, but it's a Pan-Africanism that ultimately forces us to deal with what it means to be human. It is the reality of a notion of Ubuntu and a notion of claiming the humanity within all of us, so that I am because you are, I see you, you see me. How are the children doing? Or the kind of notion of humanity that we have and notions of civilization that we believe in terms of the trajectory we're on right now. And that notion of humanity and civilization says to me two things that we have to do. We have to celebrate and understand the construct of Afrophobia. That World Council of Churches has been very important and critical in making us and penetrating the faith community's understanding of this moment. But also, I think we have to understand that this Afrophobia has to be viewed through the lens of an Afrofuturism, which takes us to another set of questions. My grandmother always told me that you can ask the wrong questions and have the right answers. It is much better not to have the answers to the right questions. And so, as I think about recommendations and the place I want to take us to, there's just a couple of things I want to highlight. I want to highlight what it means for us to celebrate the metaverse and not understand what's at risk with the metaverse. We have a race to space movement, and that race to space is being driven by a business model that is based on the University of Chicago's model of what it means to make profit at any cost. And so a part of that equation has nothing to do with our spirituality or the quality of life for us. We also have artificial intelligence. I spent part of my life doing software development. I understand the power of artificial. Oh, Lord have mercy. Please celebrate. We got to stand up. Dion, I am sorry. Reverend Dr. Dion was there in my house. Her spirit, our daughter in the ministry, she is the chaplain of this place here. She has made it possible for us as an NGO, as people of African descent, across faith, to come into this space and claim it. I said, and I said, God has spoken. Let the people say so. I say.
Ashe.
But I had to, and grace the place where our people, our elders are gathering to have this conversation. The accident took my speech, but not my voice. So we are here, and we must declare justice as a people of faith. Reparatory justice is the justice. And it is not separate from who we are created as God's people. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. It's my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thursday.
The first day since the accident, I put on my collar. Yeah. Since 18 August last year. And this week, and this gathering, you don't know people that look like us in this place are necessary to work together for the liberation of our people. Too many of us still are dying. So don't just talk, but please, we must act, not tomorrow, but today.
Yes.
Please do not let just one more gathering just be because you want to be seen. We must put our faith in an action, and not just let this be in faith. I am here because of you. Ubuntu is real. Yes. May we live it out in this day together.
Yeah.
Bye. Mama is.
And for the prayers, for all your prayers, please keep it coming. I need them, but I cannot. With it is hard to fight some days. But no, we are all together. We can fight. And Baba, right, told me I found that I can whisper, and there is no sound. I can sing, there is no sound. So please, I don't know if everyone can hear me now.
Yes.
But God is in the whisper.
Yes.
So even if you whisper your prayers, may there be holy fire under those prayers, and may their feet be put into those prayers so that we can change what is happening now in present, the future, and for that generation to come. I did not intend to speak. Plus, Bishop. But with every day, there are mercies. And with those mercies comes responsibility. And with, for Christians, this is the season of Pentecost. And so there is the holy fire that we move in. And for our family of faith, in whatever faith tradition you are, that you have, God has kissed your skin and made it brown and beautiful. We must look after one another and the generations that we are responsible for too. So I am sitting back to listen to what you have to say, but please know I am praying too that these will not just stop in this room. This is your home, so you are welcome here, so that we can work together, we can labor together, we can think together, and then we must fight together to change the realities that we see of injustice from nation to nation. Yes. A global reality and a global fire must come. Yeah, this. Yes, they go. Not just talk. Yes. But global fire that will cleanse and that will continue to burn. May the embers not stop, but they continue with all of you. Yes, sure.
Well, our daughter has just given us the first and the last recommendation. We must maintain the sacred fire. It ain't just any old fire. It is the sacred fire. And it is the sacred fire that allows us to understand that it is the unseen which has the power and authority to reign and to bring forth the justice that we see. And so I just want to end by celebrating the witness that God sent into this room. This is a living witness of what we must do and we must be, and her words must empower us. And so let us understand, though, that we are to build a fire with full understanding against what we're up. And we are up against a whole lot in terms of who has the hands of power in their hands, in terms of the way to take control over the narrative, through control over the metaverse, in terms of the way to manipulate the human physicality of what it means to control biogenetics, the practice of eugenics, and how epigenetics and the trauma within impact all of us. And most especially, we must understand from the point of view of those of us in the diaspora in the United States, that Pan-Africanism talked about 100 years ago and 50 years ago is a different landscape today. We now have BPAC, which is transforming what it means to be Black in terms of systems of oppression. And so we must not be lured by the divide and conquer and those who buy into a false illusion of being an honorary white person, and therefore think they can catapult over our backs on our oppression to become the new oppressors. But most importantly, what we must maintain is to know that we can control what we can control. And most of all, we can control ourselves. So I'll start and stop where I began, which is to say, what is going to happen if we turn around and the new master looks like us?
So we will take time now to hear from Dr. Amara, who has joined us. We would like to, yes, you please join us at the dais. Please welcome her with
Let's do this. I can go. Okay. She's more content. Okay. Because actually, Dr. Brothers, what you said actually dovetails into what I'm going to say anyway. So when in April, I don't know how many of you over there in Baltimore at the Institute of the Black World, they had a State of the Black World Conference. And while there, Cam and Dr. Amara, well, shoot, let me even talk about this part. They did a breakout session talking about the need for unity within the reparations movement. And I actually, I found a lot of resonance with what they were both saying, but Cam had lifted up some threats, actually a lot of threats. But I'm just going to say a couple of them, just in the interest of time. But some of the threats that I think we need to be aware of, because as the embers of the fires are burning, which is a great thing, I think that we don't want to be caught unawares by the threats to the movement. We don't want it to float because we're not paying attention to the devil in the details. Okay. So some of the things that Cam had lifted up are chaos in the movement, contending organizations, contending ideologies, who qualifies, so the scarcity mentality, around reparations. We talked about organizational egotism, political immaturity. Also talked about plagiarism and claiming of others' works, competitiveness over cooperation, and who can make the biggest and boldest reparations demand. Now, this is a non-exhaustive list. I just picked out, just a few that stood out to me. But just off the tails of what you said, Dr. Carruthers, I think we have to really think about the fact that we can perpetuate the white supremacist order if we're not careful, particularly when it comes to the changing demographics in the Black community in the US, right? So I speak as a first-gen Nigerian American. Parents came in the early 70s. Our people with descent from the Ibibio ethnic group, which was taken in the transatlantic slave trade. Neighboring tribes is the Igbo people, so we're all in the mix, right? But if we don't account for that and those changes, then I think we can really do ourselves some harm. So according to Pew Research, an estimated 47.2 million people in the US identified as Black in 2021. The Black population has grown by more than 10 million since 2000. When 36.2 million of the US population identified as Black, marking a 30% increase over 2 decades. So in 2021, there were 4.8 million foreign Black Americans, about 10% of the US Black population. This is an increase from 2000, when 2.4 million people, or 7% among the Black population were foreign born. And so I think that one of the threats to the movement, and actually one of my statements that I'm actually going to make today is talking about the diaspora wars and the ways that we can imbibe white supremacist lies about one another, which prevents xenophobia, anti-Blackness, these jibes across the diaspora that we see online and in real life. And we see those contentions even within the reparations movement, even though reparations is a Pan-African project. Should all be clear on that. But we see those tensions and that division in there. So I think one of the threats that I want to lift up today is a lack of political education. And so we are having to, I think we need some public political education that has to happen within the church and the changing demographics of the Black church, which include African churches and Caribbean churches, where we can begin to really make those connection points. And also the upper Black middle class too. We gotta go across. we gotta cut across class, distinctions as well. And so being able to actually educate people there in the church about the connection between their faith and reparations, and make that plain for them, right? Particularly in light of the problematic U.S. Africa policy that's happening now, where they are now defining and dividing the African diaspora in the U.S. between old and new, which I find to be actually diabolical, because we already have a very tenuous, situation as it is, and so making that type of that distinction, that delineation, is going to cause irreparable harm. And so that's one of my recommendations I'm going to make on the floor, making it now, just to make sure it really gets in the record that that framework has got to be started, and we have got to come up with new language that can represent the beautiful tapestry of ethnic diversity within the African diaspora in the US. And I know we can because we're imaginative people. And I actually think we have an opportunity, in all that, I think we have an opportunity actually for robust, rich Pan-African connectivity because of the changing dynamics in the diaspora and in the US. I actually think that this opportunity for us to actually reconnect, reunify, and just begin some nation building, if you will, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to lift up, some of those things. I want to make sure I put on my little, okay, my interventions are in there. Okay, I think we're good. So, okay, Dr. Amara.
So I guess because apologies for this even first pass, so I needed a little bit of context. Because when I came in, there was the whole thing going on and wanted to just kind of flow with what was happening. But I think if we're talking about the current challenges, that we're talking about the current threats, if you will, and opportunities too, I guess. So yeah, the challenges and the threats. But I think that you did a good job of setting forth a lot of what we've been in these discussions now across the country, around the world, that are happening within the reparations movement. I think what I would add to the conversation is really from the perspective of those who we are inviting into the process of repair, and specifically the importance of being able to articulate what repair looks like. And so there is an emerging trend of states, institutions that are hearing, at least in my view, they're hearing this escalating call for reparations. They're seeing this, heightened awareness and a vocal push for reparations. And so, in my view, they are trying to kind of get out in front of it by developing their interventions that they're casting as reparations or repairs. But what's actually happening is, how can you develop an intervention without actually following the lead of or engaging those who are harmed? And so you'll hear about apology funds, for example. So if you can look at what's happening in Denmark, elsewhere in Europe and the Netherlands, where they're putting together an apology fund. What is that? Like who came up with that, and who determined how much is in the fund? These kinds of questions, but the idea is to undermine the push for actual repair, because the remedy has to be constructed by those who are harmed. That's a principle. So when we talk about African principles of restorative justice, for example, you don't engage in a process of restorative justice without the people who are harmed in the process. And so a lot of these interventions that are being put forth go so far as to the comfort level of the perpetrator of the harm. And we have to be very clear about calling that out where we see it, because repair doesn't only extend to the comfort level of the perpetrator. If that were the case, someone punches me in the face or whatever, and my nose is broken, I have medical bills, but they just say, oh, well, yeah, no, my bad. That's all they're willing to do. They're not coming out of pocket. They're not doing anything about the medical bills. That's insufficient. It's insufficient. It doesn't actually remedy the harm to the extent that I feel that I have been restored in some way. And so as a collective, we have to be very, very aware of what's being announced, a little less eager to applaud when these announcements are made. And also we have to be following the follow-through on the announcements, because a lot of them are public pronouncements for the sake of PR but there's no substance and there's no follow through, nor is there any intent to follow through. So these are very real. I consider them to be perhaps challenges, if you will, to the reparations movement, because if we go down this path and we accept anything that's put forth, we're diluting the repair. We're also catering to the comfort of perpetrators of crime, which means there's no accountability, right? And accountability is a key component of any reparative agenda. So we'll see that happening, I think, increasingly. And so it's just for us to pause and actually assess what's being put forward, and for us to actually be clear about what we're demanding in any context, whether it's a local context, a national context, or an international context. Because if we have red lines, then we can determine to those parties that we have to engage what the repair looks like. But if we don't have the red lines, we're not clear. Well, they can put anything, and someone will say, "Oh yeah, that's great," and then we're going down a path that's actually not reparative. It's not restorative. That was exactly pacifying or assuaging us so that they can, try to run down and pop and hope that this issue goes away and just move on to other things. So that's what I would offer as sort of my view of a very real challenge, but something that we could get. We still have the opportunity to get out of it. Thank you.
I did have one more recommendation that I did put it on the floor yesterday, but I do want to lift it up to you all too today. That in light of Madam President FC Campbell Barr's letter, open letter to the Pope, that we would push, PFAD for tangible follow-ups, to the Pope. We got to keep that fire under the Pope and the Vatican to make sure that there's a response and that there's tangible follow-up, on that open letter, which is what also Cam lifted up as well in the next presentation too. So just wanted to add that in there.
Thank you all so very much. I have a question to the panel with respect to a challenge to the reparations movement, that being the challenge of history, and how we interpret history in this movement. Heretofore, what I've noticed is that there's a disjointed hermeneutic of history as it were, meaning that there are those who attempt to divorce the atrocities of slavery, its aftermath, to the lived experiences of people of African descent today. So much so as to ask Black folks to make this Faustian choice between you want to deal with the atrocities of the past, you want to deal with the atrocities of the present, or what could come as a result of this work in the future. But if we take seriously Dr. Carruthers' take on her suggestion that there's epigenetic trauma encoded within our DNA, then how do we address this challenge of history so that we're not divorcing the lives of our ancestors and our lived experience, but that we, in an honest way, with integrity, fight for reparations in a way that deals with this history challenge head on. I'm thinking about this, particularly within the US context, where you had book bans and all types of people who were weaponizing history in order to diminish the work and movement so far. And again, this challenge of history, I think it undermines the fundamental moral claim that harm has been done, and we need to repair it. So to the panel, how should we address this challenge?
Thank you. I'll begin by lifting up invoking ancestral blessing and memory of Chancellor Williams. From his piece of his book, his classical book, began with old man telling a young man in a conversation. The young man asked the old man, "I heard that the people of Samaria were here. What happened to them?" And the old man said, "They forgot to tell this story." And that's exactly the connectivity between history and one's assessment of where we are. That is the Sankofa methodology, the paradigm of historiography that I think we have to lift up. that you must fetch the past in order to understand where you are so that you can co-create the future. And so we are, in my view, obligated. We have a sacred obligation to maintain the sacred fire to connect the two. And in the common wisdom of my grandmother, we must ask the right questions. And so, Devin, I would say that when they say that to you, you tell them those are the wrong questions. You cannot disconnect our history from our present.
Yes. I would simply add that what Dr. Carruthers is pointing to is our legacy of impact. And I think that's really important. You heard it earlier today. She's citing the philosophy of psychology. That is African. And so much of the answers that we have are looking at the pattern of who we are today. Being African today is what matters. Where are we in terms of our own identity, of having the affinity of who we really are in this moment? And when we speak about faith and spirituality, I believe it was Dr. Amara this morning who said something about we need to examine, we need to scrutinize what we've been taught, even about whatever faith you were taught, and ask those critical questions. Yes, for example, Christianity didn't just come from Europeans to the continent of Africa. Ethiopia, Egypt, Nubia, Sudan. Hello. Where did Jesus go when he was born? I'm just saying. We got to rename, rewrite from a lens of being African, who we are, whose we are, and not stay in a moment of lament, but as we were saying this morning, live to be people of hope and to reimagine, be creative, and innovate, because the onus is going to be on us to figure it out.
I would only add that when I think about the ways that people try to bifurcate, the history, which one do you want to do? It's false choice. I think about the site of the harm, and the site of the harm is on the shores of Africa. It was stolen from their land, from their families, taken and captured, commodified and packed on those boats of terror, and if we start from, say, the present, results of our impact of the transatlantic slave trade, then we erase, we undermine, and we disregard the lives of our ancestors and distant relatives who died en route, who fought, or even chose to take their own lives because they would not die by the hands of their enslavers. And so we have to start at the site of the harm with regard to the transatlantic slave trade. There's just no getting around that. We are Africans through and through, no matter where we are, where we find ourselves, and no matter our social location and where we enter. People.
Oh, yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes before we want to conclude this conversation. Is there any questions from the audience? I see one hand in the back. Two of you. Okay, so I'll start with my sister in the back. I'll bring the mic to you.
Oh.
I'm glad to Congress was formed in 2002. It's an international reparations organization. I'm struggling this week with the language, which I kind of know won't go. But I'm going to say Afrophobia has been said here. Would you prefer the term Afrophobia with an I because it's about the continent, not a hairstyle? You can't have reparations as Africans as a society, especially reparations organisations, are not central to the decision making. So one of the things that we're doing in the UK is talking to the Church of England about the 100 million that they've set aside to ensure that reparations organisations actually, with experience of reparations, are part and parcel of that discussion.
And the point I would really like to have clear is faith has done so much damage to African people, or people who've used faith as an excuse to do damage. How do we deal with Africans who think that church, mosque, whatever, are actually harmers and oppressors and can't see that it's the individuals who have used for the faith that is the problem, not the faith themselves?
I appreciate your comment. You reminded me back to the debates we had 4 years ago about African, Afrocentric, Afrocentric, et cetera. And just last week, I think Northwestern University changed their department back from African American studies to Black studies because it represented a more globalized construct. So I understand and affirm your critique there. I would say that we have to be real clear that there's a distinction between faith, institutionalized religion, and person's beliefs and their spirituality. And what I like to frame is that it is the African spirituality and all of this diversity which undergirds all of the religion. And it is an African spirituality which does not separate the material from the immaterial, the seen from the unseen. It is an ontological point of view about the power of the sacred that I think is important. And so part of what James Cone and James Cone's brother gave to us was an understanding that Black people in the United States, for example, did not convert to Christianity, but in fact, they took African spirituality and understood its essence within that experience that was called Christianity. And so part of the work we must do is to go back and fetch our contribution to Christianity, which is foundational. And so we must really embrace and be willing to struggle with what it's going to take for those of us who are Christian, for example, to understand Christianity before Christ.
I will add just one quick thing, and nobody's gonna like what I'm gonna say, but I'm gonna say it anyway. And that is, most of us speak a colonial tongue. English is not a historic language of the African experience necessarily. You know what I'm saying? So I would just urge us, or we can speak about Portuguese. I mean, we can speak about all the Romance languages, right? It's not just English I'm pointing to here, okay? All of the Romance languages, but other languages too. So what I would offer up is, I think we have to be clear about what are definitions. What is the substance of definition? Whether if you use the term Afrikaner, Black diaspora, African diaspora, who are we talking about? We're talking about us. And I would encourage us not to get caught up in the colonial language. I would urge us to get caught up in the definitions and the substance of what the language, which is always an approximation, is trying to suggest. And to really find ways to create new possibilities of speaking about who we are as a collective, which is Pan-African.
On the second point, a question that I think is really important, particularly for those who do not subscribe to any of the Abrahamic religions, for example. And to Dr. Coretta's point, that for African people, it's not even using the term religion, I think diminishes what the spirituality is, which is actually how we exist in the world and our position in the universe. And there are some fundamental principles that those of us who are practitioners of our indigenous spirituality, our cosmovision, our cosmology, understand that allow us to be able to parse out the corruptions of organized religion, particularly Christianity, because there are cultural elements that are always infused in any of these religions. So there is a European context to Christianity as it was proliferated and promulgated on the continent and outside of the continent to perpetuate a certain end, which was to enslave and to strip people of their own identity, which was diminished and called evil for the purposes of being able to use human beings for profit. The groundwork was laid on the spiritual realm. Any tradition that requires disconnection, any tradition that requires external, where you have to be looking outside of yourself, at least I'll just speak for mine. It's a telltale that it's not actually who we are. Why? Because for a culture that believes in the interconnectedness of all things, how can I then look outside of myself and outside of ourselves for some kind of, to be saved? Anything that does not respect the natural and the supernatural is a telltale sign, because we believe that we're connected. That means we cannot abuse the land. Those of us who we have traditions and rights with regard to the land, with regard to nature, with regard to the sun, water, all of these things. So if there's any tradition that is running afoul of that, you have to question its basis. And so perhaps it's not necessarily the label, but what are the fundamental principles by which those people who practice that tradition are living? And is it aligned with who we know ourselves to be as Africans? And what you'll find, unfortunately, is that in many of the faith, what we call the faith, which is, if it's Christian, that there is an alignment. That doesn't mean that we have to now do away with Christianity. As Dr. Greta said, our spirituality supersedes, transcends, underpins, comes before any of those things. So it's actually a process of rediscovering and coming into alignment internally to then let that drive what you decide that you believe. It's an internal process. And unfortunately, with the way that we evangelize and the way evangelism occurs, it's a very external thing. And it preaches looking outside of ourselves to be saved, looking to other people. It preaches just these things that it's like wearing a sweater that doesn't fit. It's like too small, it doesn't fit, and it doesn't fit. But when you're conditioned in a way, it can be difficult to try to parse through all of that to get to the fundamental principles and whether they're aligned with who we believe that we are as African people. And every single person has to go through that process. In my view, your parents can take you to a certain point. I know mine tried, but we all have to traverse that path and come to our own understanding of who we are. And when you do, you'll feel alignment. You'll feel a peace about what you believe. And you also won't feel the need to defend it to outsiders who actually don't understand it and therefore try to demonize it.
Thank you so much. Can we give another round of applause for our panel? We've come to the moment where we have to conclude this conversation. This has truly been a historic moment. We want to thank Dr. Angelique and her sister, Yemeni, for organizing this tremendous conversation. Yes. And as we close, I just want to remind us of the legacy and history of Ms. Callie House. Dr. Carruthers looked it up. We're reminded that at the turn of the 20th century, this house was responsible for building a reparations organization that had over 300,000 dues paying members. Before the NAACP, before the National Urban League, before there was the Divine Nine, it was Ms. Callie House that built movement momentum for where we are. So the question I will leave us is, if our ancestors, like Ms. Callie House, did so much with so little, why can't we do much more with all that we've been given? And with that, here's Dr. Hunter.
I want to thank my moderator. Can we think of- So this moment was not scheduled. First, just want to thank Dr. Carruthers for ushering in our dear souls and director and captain for UN, the Reverend beyond this year. Call her name. She's done a great work here, and we've lived to see her come back to us. Amen. So we just want to thank everyone, the International Civil Society Working Group that comes alongside Permanent Forum, my co-leader, Dr. Sheldon Williams, and our leader, Dr. Mark Kenya. We want to thank ADNA, Advocacy Network, Africa, and we want to thank, of course, the Arab Nations. They're all of our sponsors right here. We just thank God. But I do want to give an announcement that is really very somber, very sobering. One of our very dear sisters of the faith, who I was close to, has now passed on to the ancestors. I just learned this from Brother Smith, who runs our WCC office here. And her name is, you will know it, Dr. Agnes Evelyn. Dr. Agnes was our first woman of Africa and African descent to become the leader of the World Council of Churches, the model. In 2013, when we were in a place called Busan, South Korea, the Republic of South Korea, the people of the world of faith in the World Council of Churches had the presence and heart of mind to elect her to this amazing post. We've just learned that she has just passed on while we've been here. Some of us work with her very closely, like I did. She's a matriarch, great woman from Kenya, from Nairobi area, and also the rural areas there. And she comes from that first and second generation of women, like on this panel, in the ecumenical movement, who had the courage, the audacity to be Pan-African, to be prepared for her camp, who studied and showed herself amazingly approved for all, as the scriptures would say. But I want to invite you now to have a moment of silence, of thanksgiving for this amazing woman who has stood for us. She is what we are talking about. Reparatory justice, ecclesial examination, movement, people. She stood with the people. And what she was the people. A revolutionary of faith in her own. But now she's with the ancestors. So we rejoice with our sister. We rejoice also in the life that God has called for. To our beloved, Dr. Agnes Evelyn. Will you bow with me in we give thanks, O Holy One. Whatever name that we have on our lips or in our hearts, for the great legacy and life of Dr. Agnes Evelyn, one who served faithfully for many years, made a difference, and represented all of us. May she be received into the heavenly places as she joins the great course of the ancestors. May we follow the ancestors like her for this moment, this secular moment given to us by grace and by your power. May we go and do likewise. We thank you. We praise you. We say, Asante, thank you. Amen and Ashe.
I hear God say to her as she enters in, rest, my good and faithful servant. Well,
Ashe.
God, we thank you for joining us for this historic conversation. We are now at the conclusion